All right, I think, are we recording and broadcasting? All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Today is December 6, 2024. We're here to discuss AO 2024-105 and 105S, which is the proposal for sales tax. This work session is a presentation that is coming from local community organizations and other entities, nonprofits, et cetera, that want to have an opportunity to be heard. And so we're going to go ahead and start with just introductions to the members. Start with Mr. Salt.
Randy Salt, Felix Rivera, Mark Littlefield,
Karen Bronga.
Daniel Bolland.
Christopher Constant. And I know Annabelle is here nearby somewhere on the phone. We have Mr. Martinez. You there? Oh, he's checked out. Okay, smart. And then we have a series of panelists. I don't think we'll go through and do introductions first. And then we have a series of panelists. I don't think we'll go through and do introductions. Okay, I don't know what that was, but yep, we have full room. And the instructions to the folks who are going to present were pretty much similar to the instructions that were to the members who made the previous presentations. You guys get to drive to the degree that you can. You have limited time, and I will manage the queue and ensure that we get everyone heard. We would like to spend maybe 40 minutes on presentations and have room for discussion and questions and inputs, because work sessions are informative to the assembly. They're not for debate. And this will be first time in a long time we've had this many outside representatives to present to us. And so I think that ACLT was going to take the first. Yeah, go ahead, Kurt.
Thank you, Kirk Rose. I'm the CEO of Anchorage Community Land Trust. I am joined by colleagues Jen Griffiths with the Alaska Children's Trust, Celeste Hodge-Browden with the Alaska Black Caucus, and Wendy Linskog and Lisa Aquino, who are here today representing the Foraker Governance and Public Policy Board. We're really happy to be here. We're a loose, unaffiliated group of nonprofits. We had inputs from across the city on the sales tax, and we're here working to sort of put all of those inputs in one place and tell you a little bit about what the community is saying and what we're seeing on this item. I don't pretend to be a policy expert. I only play one on Zoom, but here today, as someone who's an expert on community building. I've worked in my career to do 15 years roughly in economic revitalization work and community development work in low-income neighborhoods. And so we come today to provide insight on this sales tax. We don't come as antagonists in any way. We come as skeptics, not cynics. And I want to first and foremost thank AEDC and Jenna Wright for inviting this input from our group and for taking the time to meet with us over and over again. I want to thank the Assembly for taking time to do that as well. The long and short of this, I think, is really who does this tax benefit and who is least benefited by it or most impacted or even harmed. And this cost of this tax is significant and meaningful to low-income people. And we are bringing recommendations today, I think, that are directionally, at least the thrust of them feels the same as some of the recommendations that were made earlier in this work session. And so, no worries.
I'll take the moment to notice that Mr. Martinez and Mr. Presverdia have joined us.
So we have a short presentation prepared for you today. It's saving plenty of time for your questions and discussions. Our goal at this work session is to create greater opportunity for equity in this proposal for low-income and underserved communities. Some steps already are being taken to mitigate regressivity. We think that's great. We think more ought to be. I had the chance to listen to Chair Constant at the Alaska Black Caucus's Equity Center grand opening, and one of the chair's comments was how proud he was of the equity lens the Assembly took on considering the Muni ARPA disbursement. I would ask you to consider taking that same lens on this proposal. Equity is really about power and process, and we have concerns about community inclusion throughout this effort in places where the most powerful have had voices while others have been left out. We want to see a proposal more considerate of the hardship this will place on the most vulnerable and low-income families who are struggling to make it today, families like mine growing up. So next slide, please. We shared in our materials in the lead up to this data from both ICER as well as ITEP, the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy. who also had a chance to meet with some of the Northern Compass group as well as project sponsors. Basically, both have concluded the same thing, is that the proposal in this iteration of the sales tax struggles with regressivity. You can see a basic breakdown of what that means. You all are familiar. Next slide. But the important thing of that first slide was just amplifying the second slide from ICER. So you see in the following graphs that the lowest income people and families are paying the highest percentage relative to their incomes. So much of our thrust today is how to rectify that, because those dollars to those low income people, those deciles represented by 1, 2, 3, and 4, are absolutely crucial to low income moms, disabled veterans, new to America families, and others who may not own property in this city. So from the ICER report, the lowest income decile is paying 36x more than the highest in terms of projected net change in their taxation. So compared to the highest decile, deciles 2 to 5 are paying 7 to 10% more. These are dollars that are even more precious because they are scarce for those low income families. So let's extrapolate some real numbers from that, again, using the ICER data. Next slide, please. I really think about this from my own lived experience. And I grew up in a single mom household with 3 kids. So I'm thinking about this as a low income family of 4 making just above the poverty line. The overall framing is that this proposal currently taxes a low income family of 4 between $720 and $960. It's essentially between $180 and $270 per capita. These are unanticipated, unplanned for expenses that no family is currently budgeting for and which will cause hardship. This tax is expensive for everyone, even with a tax refund, but even more so for low-income families who are already making really, really challenging decisions about where their dollars go. Some of the steps that have been taken to this point are good first steps, but we would offer that more needs to be considered, because nearly $1,000 is hugely significant to my family growing up and would have created all sorts of hard decisions for my family. Anchorage is already an expensive place to live. And let's be sure that let's be honest, a retired vet or a new to American family may never be able to make these kinds of hard decisions. So $180 per capita is the difference between making rent, decisions around medical decisions, unexpected additional costs. So this is a big deal and something that really needs your consideration. Next slide, please. Another, I think, unintended consequence of the current proposal is demonstrated on the next slide. Many of those who are receiving the biggest benefits are commercial property owners and large-scale businesses. When you have one group who's receiving tax refunds and another who isn't, you have one group that's paying for tax refunds of another. In this case, I worry about low-income people paying for the tax refunds of large corporations. I think it's important to question this breakdown of refunds and ask for reconsideration. If we think about this in an example, imagine a large multifamily housing unit, 60 families living somewhere. All those families have to go buy winter coats and mittens and hats. In some form, since they're renters, they're not receiving a refund in the current proposal, but some amount of those expenses are being refunded to their landlord or the owner of that 60 unit facility, right? I think another thing that the ICER report really pulled out is that out-of-state landlords are represented in this graph, and that at least some amount of property tax refund is going to homeowners and corporations that are housed out of state. ICER even went so far as to suggest that any benefit recovered from visitors would essentially be nearly given back to out-of-state residents and corporations. So next slide, please. So one of the things that we appreciated from our engagement with AEDC and with Northern Compass up to this point was they said, bring us your suggestions. So we come today, not just to call out criticisms or places where we're skeptical, but to make a few recommendations that we hope can level the playing field. So the first thing that we propose is looking at the levers. How can we find ways to mitigate regressivity and consider the 40% of Anchorage residents not receiving a tax refund currently? So next slide, please. Similar to the thrust of Member Zoldel, I think there's a couple ways to think about how you slice the pie. If we think about how we look at these levers, really consider the needs of low-end people and offer them a tax refund as well. We think we can start to see a more proportional tax that way. We also think that this mechanism could be finessed to do the same thing. We're not here coming with answers or hard numbers on this, but I think it's just important to see the pie sliced a different way and consider how that makes a difference for our lowest income and most vulnerable community members. So when you start to cut that pie that way, there's two ways to think about it. I think the other way to think about it is to resize the pie, right? If you want to continue to maximize property tax refunds, then potentially how is additional revenue coming into the process to make that work? So next slide, please.
One sec. I think we have some questions. Oh, Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious, how do you do, if you go back one slide, how do you do the refund? What's the
We're
mechanism?
coming to it, member.
Okay, excellent.
Yep. Thank you. So finally, we wanted to essentially just share our recommendations before I turn it over to my colleagues here. So we're going to talk with you a little bit more about exactly what the member was asking, how a tax refund for non-property owners could work, and examples from across the country. Options for considering additional revenue, such as looking at the 1K tax threshold. We recommend considering elevated tax threshold, but potentially tapering the tax. So moving it down from 3% to say 1.5% or 1% for transactions over $5,000. We want to reestablish an inclusive and equitable process for community engagement. One of my favorite mantras, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I think the project sponsors have done a great job of creating momentum, and now we need to bring the whole community into this. And I really think we need to think about voices that haven't been heard on this item and how we can bring them in. We appreciate the discussion earlier about an exemption for low-income residents. We definitely would recommend that you increase that threshold or move the exemption tier upwards so that more people are exempted, not just our lowest income. There's, I think, a robust discussion to be had around the MAPS projects and how to ensure that they see equitable participation from across the community, as well as are delivered in some of our lowest income neighborhoods where they can be true sources of economic revitalization for those communities. And finally, and you'll hear more from my colleagues on this as well, is exempting nonprofit organizations. So that's our very quick down and dirty presentation. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jen Griffiths, to talk more about the tax refund opportunity.
Before you do that, I have a couple questions. Ms. Alto.
Thanks. You said something about shifting the tax to like 1.5% over. Can you say it again? It went right past me.
Yeah, I think right now, I appreciate the conversation around competitiveness. We've all heard that example over and over again of we don't want to lose business to the valley because of tax on buying a new car or something like that. If you think about increasing that tax threshold to say $5,000 or $10,000 transactions, and you consider tiers for that taxation, right? So any expense over say $5,000 could be taxed at a different rate. Let's say 1.5%, so that we don't have that 3% figure, which could potentially impact competitiveness, but that we still see revenue generated from larger scale transactions.
Got it. So it's an alternative to just taxing everything all the way. So removing the exact rate, removing a cap on tax cap threshold, basically, and saying, well, when you hit this threshold, we just lower the tax to a different percentage.
And I don't pretend to be an economist or haven't gamed out what that could mean, but if you looked at including larger transaction sizes taxed at a smaller rate, there is more revenue potentially to be had from this.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
All right, Ms. Brawley.
Thanks. I guess I wanted to be in the queue later, but I am curious to hear about this refund. It sounds like that's coming up.
All right, then go ahead and proceed.
Thank you, Kirk, and thanks to the Assembly members for just creating this space for this conversation today. I'm Jen Griffiths, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Alaska Children's Trust. I will talk about a couple of these recommendations. The first one is the tax refund recommendation. So this recommendation is to consider expanding the refund aspect of this proposal to include a tax refund that would target lower income households, including those who are non-property owners. An example of this type of policy can be seen in Washington State's Working Families Tax Credit, which uses an earned income tax credit structure at the federal level to inform a state level tax credit for low income residents. The intention behind this tax credit was to address the regressivity of Washington State's sales tax by returning some of the sales tax revenue to low income residents. The second recommendation that I want to provide just a little bit more context on is related to exemptions. So one of the things that we would recommend is just an in-depth analysis of all of the exemptions, both the broad and the specific, and how they interact with each other and what their impact is on low-income residents. Exemptions are a really important part of tax policy, but especially when they're specific, they can be poorly targeted and not a really good tool for addressing regressivity. So looking at all of the exemptions together and doing an analysis of how those are going to impact different income brackets, but specifically looking at how all of those exemptions taken as a whole will impact those in our lower income brackets is an important aspect of moving forward with the policy. Turn it over to Sylvia.
I have a handful of questions. First, Ms. Brawley, then Ms. Alta.
Thanks. And I appreciate you bringing this refund. I was curious because I was also looking at things like credits or rebates, and a lot of those really are a function of having an income tax. So they're not available to us as a credit. So it looks like Washington State does not have that. So I wonder if you have a little more information how it actually works. And then my other question is, given that there's amendments to have more of a hardship exemption or really addressing it in a different way, have you guys thought about kind of the relative merits of that refund mechanism versus this other idea? Thanks.
Great question. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I'm speaking to both of these recommendations together. I think that the question of a broad exemption versus a broad tax credit, there's some analysis that would need to be done to determine what is best. There is a lot of movement towards the utilization of tax credits to address poverty. We've seen the benefits of that at the federal level with the expanded child tax credit. So there's a lot of conversation about that. Washington State is a great example of how to utilize a credit when an income tax doesn't exist. And that was designed through their Department of Revenue. There's a lot of great information online. Another thing that they do is they have an advisory council that actually works with those staff designing that and working with that exemption to make sure that it's doing what it needs to do.
Ms. Alta.
Thanks. Anna got to really kind of the heart of my questions as well. But when we talk about low income, what are we talking about? Like, right, we all use that term in different ways. You see in the handout I've provided, I'm hoping we move out of a discussion about the federal poverty level and we talk about something else. But what's our consensus? Do we have a consensus? I guess is my question.
Yeah, I mean,
I would argue we don't. I would argue we don't. And, you know, one of the things that in our prep for this, we said we don't want to appear to be subject matter experts. I agree that tacking to the federal poverty level feels very inadequate here. I think the thrust of your proposal, members Aldel, would find general agreement around here of what that figure would be, but tagging to somewhere near area median income and slicing off a chunk. But no, we don't have a number that we're bringing today.
Okay, that's fair. And I appreciate the feedback because we're talking about our, because what I noticed in the Washington State one is you still have to go apply. So, right, how many people might we be talking about to go through a process? And then what are the benefits of that process? And then is that process layered on with 5 other processes you're having to undertake, or how do we want to tackle that? So that's where my mind is. Thank you.
And I would add to that then, and myself in the queue, that this actually, the idea of a tax credit versus an exemption is very interesting to me. And if it were tied to this universal application of services, then we actually get to a point where we're starting to create a systemic approach to achieving a number of outcomes, which is helping people get through barriers that have been historically in place. And so it doesn't mean to signal that I'm shifting gears, but it's certainly a good, important question to grapple with, because if we could get it on that end and we set it up so once a year, like maybe even work with the state and the permanent fund application, probably take a state law change where folks' information is somehow set over, that we could create a meaningful approach to achieve this outcome, as long as it were at a level that was, yeah, I know it's hard to work with the state on those things, but
No, we could have set the example for this.
right, yeah, I don't want to say that on the record too much, but it does happen. Yeah, it does happen. So, okay, Mr. President.
Yeah, I want to just explore for a second what our attorney Dean Gates said earlier in an earlier meeting, where he was talking about the difference between charter and code, and what of this would need to be in the charter amendment, and what of this could be handled in code. And so I was wondering if you have thoughts. But I know you're not necessarily experts in that, but I'm curious about that. There may not be an answer, but yeah, so that I just want to I guess put that on the record and maybe have that be part of this conversation. Thanks.
I don't know that you could answer that question, and you might want to, but really I think that's a attorney question. And the attorney question, if I might restate, just so it's restated, is that what elements of this would be reserved for ordinances afterwards, and what would need to be in the place for the charter amendment relative to a tax credit program?
Well, I'm not sure about tax credits, but when talking about exemptions, you don't need to put exemptions in the charter other than the statement that the assembly is authorized to enact exemptions by ordinance. That phrase is enough, and then you could do the exemptions for the sales tax. I'm not sure that you would need any charter language to authorize, I guess, the systems they're proposing for a tax refund. That's sort of a resource allocation. We've collected the sales tax. How are you going to allocate and spend it? That's up to the assembly to appropriate.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add a couple things to it. Because what I'm thinking is essentially what we're saying, what the public is voting on is at this point that the proposal is 2/3 of this tax are going to go to property tax relief, and 1/3 is going to go to projects that the voters choose. So if the funds are going somewhere else, that probably should be in the charter. I guess that's the point. So because otherwise we're not going to be following what was voted on. So that's where I'm trying to figure out whether the language changes. Do you look like you want to say something? I'm curious about that, because I want to make sure that what we put on the ballot obviously is very clear and we follow through with that. But I'm wondering where the line is on that. So.
And I think there are two parts to that question, and we'll have Mr. Bowman come up. He wants to speak, and I will just say it's beyond just being allowed to, but being required to, right? So getting to the point where there might be some resistance overcome if there is a structure in place. I don't know that we would want to leave it to future assemblies to say, well, we don't actually like that anymore. We want to give all of this to those people instead. So really there's that balancing question between what's required and what is optional. So it's a very interesting question. Mr. Bowman.
Thank you through the chair to Assemblymember Perez-Verdia. I'm actually just going to be building off of what the chair was just saying and what Mr. Gates was saying before. What goes in the ballot initiative is what the voters approve. So that could be as broad a language or as narrow a language as you wished. But if we say in the ballot initiative that the use of funds is to be for 2% towards property tax relief and 1% towards projects, you would then not have room to subsequently do then a tax rebate. But if you change that language, as Mr. Gates described, so that it said, as will be later approved by the assembly, and then the voters approved, as will be later approved by the assembly, you could have that broader authority, but it's the chair applied, then it could be later changed by the assembly. So the question is, do you want that grant of authority to the body, to yourselves? And will the voters agree with that?
Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add briefly that usually the term property tax relief has been sort of interpreted in many different ways. It's basically, though, in the language and specific in our charter language amendment, it's basically just saying we're using sales tax in place of what property taxes are currently used for. That's property tax relief. And I guess it's been described as a credit or so forth. But I want to point to our specific language, what it can be used for, that's in this S version on page 6 at line 35. It says the gross receipts in place of property taxes in any manner for which property taxes are authorized, which is basically any public purpose. So this is pretty broad for how the sales tax, the 2% can be used. It's described as property tax relief because we're having sales tax, we've got property taxes. We're diversifying by adding sales tax to our revenue streams, and it's called relief that way. But I think that many persons in the community and here have maybe perceived that differently than I do.
I think the risk is a bait and switch approach where you propose, oh yeah, we're going to provide a tax credit for the kind of low to moderate income people, and then we'll do it by ordinance, and then maybe you do it for a year or two, and then some other priority becomes super high priority. So then we're going to just turn the screws on the lowest income people by eliminating that program, reducing that program. And those are the people historically who don't have lobbyists to stand up and fight for them and generate programs for them and get their needs met. Instead, what happens is they get the squeeze. And so the question being really, do we put that protection in the charter if this were to go forward in that way, or do we leave it up to every other Tuesday for the rest of time? Ms. Alatil.
What I just heard Mr. Gates say is the percentage identified as to offset property tax, it's a replacement. And so if you don't use it, or what you do is you're replacing property tax with sales tax. And if you don't replace it, you ratchet down the cap. That's the consequence. And so whatever it is, if you don't identify the amount you want to have for that replacement, then you will inadvertently, or you will actually intentionally ratchet down the cap. And I think that's where you run into the issue. So to answer your question, in my mind, I lean towards charter versus code.
There are a number of concerns and interests there. Again, leaning to the matter of, man, we need time for this conversation. Back to the proposers, or back to the speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Celeste Hodge Grouden, and I am the president and CEO of the Alaska Black Caucus, a Black-led organization dedicated to championing the lives of Black people and other marginalized groups in the areas of health, economics, education, and justice. I'm here today to express our deep concerns regarding the proposed tax ordinance and its implications for equity in Anchorage. Our equity concerns fall really into three broad categories. First, the equitable application of the sales tax. By its very nature, as we know, a sales tax is regressive. It disproportionately affects those with the lowest incomes, extracting a larger percentage from their limited resources. Our community members already face significant economic challenges, and imposing this tax will only exacerbate their financial burden. We must be mindful of the impact, take my glasses off, mindful of the impact this tax will have on our most vulnerable residents. Second, we are concerned about the equitable access to the municipal area projects, MAPs. Once they are completed, many of these projects appear to operate under a pay-to-play model, which can create barriers for those who cannot afford the associated fees. As we work toward revitalizing our community, we must ensure that all residents have equal access to the benefits these projects provide, regardless of their economic status. And lastly, we must address equitable participation in the project submission and selection process. we have identified several issues that have compromised this process. First, the project submission window was poorly publicized and conducted on an unreasonable short time frame, from mid-June to September 15th. 90 days is simply not enough time to raise awareness, allow for collaboration, and develop meaningful proposals from our community. The complete list of submitted projects was never made public to my community, leaving citizens unaware of the variety of proposals submitted, both economically and thematically. Transparency is essential for fostering trust and engagement in our community. And number three, public outreach efforts failed to prioritize meaningful input from those most affected by this proposal. It is unfair to expect community members connected to marginalized groups to volunteer their time and energy without compensation for the labor they provide in support of project organizers. And as I conclude, number four, lastly, there has been a lack of transparency regarding the project selection team and the criteria used for selecting projects. The Project Anchorage Coalition did not include voices from those who will be most impacted by this tax. We must understand how this coalition was formed and who made the decisions regarding the composition. In light of these concerns, we urge the Assembly to take concrete steps to remedy these inequities before passing this proposal on to voters. It is crucial that we address issues of equity, access, and inclusivity in the process that has unfolded thus far. To truly correct these inequities, we need to slow down and allow for a more equitable, transparent process. Thank you for this time and for consideration, and we look forward to working collaboratively, collectively, to ensure that all voices in our community are heard and valued. Thank you.
On a time check, we have about 25 minutes. Ms. Braun, I didn't see you there.
I was going to ask you, so if this got to the ballot, do you think that your community, the people that you feel were not engaged in this process, are you concerned that they won't vote and so they won't have their say then? I'm just trying to figure why getting this to the ballot would be hurtful to your community.
I'll go back to what I shared, the lack of awareness. I mean, we've got to do a better job of getting this information out to all communities, especially our diverse community groups. We're so busy trying to feed our families and put food on the table. You know, this doesn't register. And we just got to do a better job. I hope that answers your question.
I think there's another answer to the question. The question was, what does it hurt if it goes to the voters?
It will hurt our communities, our diverse communities, honestly.
I might offer that, the process, if it doesn't reach into those areas of the community that are going to pay but have generally no voice, then any of the outputs, the list of projects haven't been viewed, haven't been given input really meaningfully, because those folks, I think as has been proposed, are busy trying to work their second or third job while they're trying to keep the lights on, while they're trying to feed their kids. They don't have time to stand up and go to this meeting that was invited by a number of very well-connected community interests who did all of this work. And so whatever product, if it doesn't have this kind of review, can hardly be said to represent their interests. I think that's the challenge.
Could I also weigh in on that? Or please.
So, but they can vote, and they can vote no, and then their voice will be heard. And this isn't being shoved down anyone's throat. It goes to the ballot. The voters decide, are we doing this or not? So we need to really do some great messaging with all communities about what this might do to them. It may raise costs. We really need to do a good job with that, in my opinion. That's
All right, Kurt. First, Kurt.
I just want to say, if you take a look at the assembly meetings where this was brought up for public testimony, you didn't see a lot of diverse groups out there testifying. They don't have the time like other individuals might have to get to an assembly meeting to testify about this issue. They don't, because again, their priorities are family. Their priorities are taking care of themselves and their kids. I mean, and putting food on they're working. So I don't know how else to share that. This information, I mean, almost felt like I was blindsided, honestly, and I'm in the community, but I'll leave it there. I don't want to say anything else because there you go. Thanks.
Kurt.
Yeah, I mean, to turn the question around, I think we'd say, what's the rush? And the ability to shape the effort is incredibly important for buy-in. And I believe that that's something that's absolutely been missing. And I offer that from someone who's done that work in the past. Some of these assembly members are around for the Mountain View Neighborhood Plan, which was lauded for community input. We engaged over 1,000 members of the Mountain View community in that effort. And what they said and what is in the Mountain View Neighborhood Plan is that they'd like to see investment in housing in their neighborhood. That's in a formal document that is part of the public record that was approved by this assembly. And, you know, those kinds of inputs, which we took 3 years to take the time to listen and talk to people and meet them and be sure that we reached deeply, deeply into the community to talk to people who were renters and to talk to school children in that neighborhood and to sit at the Red Apple and talk to people who were coming in to buy a head of cabbage. And so what those 1,000 people said is something quite different than was actually said by the couple hundred that weighed in here who were at a business luncheon or were connected to the business community or the outreach efforts of AEDC, which I'm not criticizing AEDC's outreach efforts. I'm just saying for this to have been a community effort, it would have been much, much, much more broad with way, way, way more input and perspective into these projects. And so my question to turn it back is, what's the rush? Why not take the time to do that and to learn deeply from our community members who are most informed about what they need in their own communities?
And I think one other answer to that question is the charter grants this body the duty to get 8 votes to take these actions based on the various considerations that we all bring to the table. And so I think that is the other answer to the question. It's not just it goes straight to the voters, let the voters decide. It has a first step, and the first step is to pass this threshold. And if it does, then it comes to the point you're making. And I think that there are at least enough people who have spoken. The questions are here. That's what I think ultimately the answers. The questions are here. What we can do, how are we going to do it? And how is it fair? How can we make it more fair? These are the questions that I think have risen up above. If you were to take it away without any judgment on the sponsors or the community members who are part of it, how can we make it more fair? I think is the ultimate question. Mr. Boland.
Thank you. So, you know, I think I agree with a lot of what is being said by my various colleagues. I think one reality is that the assembly, you know, you never know how long someone's going to be in office, right? We have 3-year terms. And then some folks will span more than that if they get reelected, right? And so we don't always have the luxury of more than that, right? To spend an indefinite amount of time on these substantial proposals. So I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge the fact that sometimes it takes someone bringing forward an idea for that idea to then be beat up and improved, right? And so I really appreciate the group that has come here today to give us their feedback, and I think it's very valuable. And I think I do see a path forward, you know, between the previous meeting and this meeting to enhance and improve and make some notable changes. But yeah, I guess I do want to acknowledge that, you know, 2 things are true. Advocates have to bring their ideas forward, and sometimes those ideas are going to be imperfect. And then also, nobody should ever bring anything to the assembly with the idea that it's not going to have modifications, right? You can bring your perfect thing, your package, your proposal with a bow on it and say, put this to the voters, but that's not necessarily what's going to happen. So anyway, I think this has been a productive discussion. Thank you.
Add that in baking with the dough, when it rises, you punch it down and then you let it rise and you punch it down. That's called proofing. And so here we are proofing or kneading this process to, yeah, I love that show, especially on TV. And the issue of perfecting the question, if possible, last note on that is that the charter also puts a higher threshold on getting this kind of question past this body, which is a signal to all of us. Exercise care in getting this question through your process, because beyond you, it's 50% plus one. Cameron.
Yeah, so I don't want to go back and engage in the whole conversation about the charter versus the code, but I do want to just say that if you roll this up, I guess I'm trying to think about how to present what you presented in a way that is part of it that the pie just needs to be split differently. I mean, is part of it that is it fundamentally this is a bad proposal and we need to go back to the drawing board, or is it that property tax relief is a viable, purpose for it, and projects that are supported by the community, whatever those projects are, is a viable, and there needs to be a third category where we're addressing some of the immediate needs of our city, or we're addressing those that are most vulnerable in our city, and that we need to figure out what to do with that piece of that pie. Because I think that part of the argument that I've heard, and I think this is a real argument, is it's really hard to think long term when you've got really difficult things happening right now. We'll always have very difficult things. We'll always have, really important, challenging things we need to address. But if we don't start thinking long term, then we'll never get there. So I think that's part of this balance that I'm hearing is how do we make sure? And I would just argue that in the time that I've been on the assembly, there is more investment in the short-term needs of this city than I've seen in a long time. And that's really great, but that still doesn't meet the needs. I mean, we still have a long way to go. But that's partly what I'm trying to think through is it just splitting the pie a little differently to make sure that the real concerns you brought forward are being addressed. But you've also put in mechanisms for how to do that. And I think that, for me, falls into the code language. Like, how do you actually activate this versus the charter language, which is here's 3 pieces of the pie. Here's what it's for. And as long as that's clear and the voters say, yes, I agree with that, we should spend this on this, this on this, and this on this. And then we're going to leave you to the mechanisms for how to do that. So that's where my head's at. And I'm wondering if there's a path forward. So thanks.
Anyone want to take a bite on that?
Again, I represent no one, and we're not any affiliated group. But we would say our core recommendation was tackle the regressivity, consider reslicing the pie in order to do that. Do that in a way that we think about and focusing on what's a livable wage in this community, and are we punishing people who are living below a livable wage? And I think we are long-term thinkers. We do care about the revitalization of Anchorage. I think that this proposal should address our biggest challenges. And for me, I think, and Members Alto, I think, said this in her comments, but one of those, maybe many others did as well, but one of those is housing. I think to leave housing unaddressed in this proposal strikes me as a miss. So that'd be another thing that I'd add.
All right, so I have Ms. Alto, Ms. Brawley, myself, and then there are 3 members of the panel who haven't been heard, and we have 15 minutes. So there's the framework of the last part of our conversation. So Ms. Brawley, or Ms. Alto.
Thank you. So I'm taking in what you're saying, and I'm really thinking hard. I think, one, I appreciate that we have a proposal forward, because I think we talk about we need more revenue in the city, and until somebody does it, right? And we've been waiting for a long time for the state to figure it out, and that certainly isn't happening. I think this body is a much more accessible, action-oriented body towards getting us somewhere. What I'm thinking about, I'm really wed to this idea of splitting a sales tax into 4 equal pieces. And one of the things I ask myself is, if we do that, right? We were talking about this idea of 7-year dedication. So I'm looking at 7-year total buckets. Okay. A quarter of the proposed property tax at the $180 million scenario, after taking out the personal property tax exemption, the administration costs, is $215,250,000. That is not money to sneeze at. And so what I am asking myself, if that kind of money goes into general government with guardrails, can it be used to expand programmatic access to traditionally run state programs? Right? Those programs often fall short, and Anchorage is left holding the bag. So I want to put that idea out there for you all to noodle a bit. You know, childcare assistance. Right now, it's based on federal poverty limit and it's very restrictive. Food assistance, housing assistance, right? You get on and you a wait list for a housing voucher. You get on a wait list, you're one of 2,000 and you wait for your turn to like get on if you got on and won the lottery. So I'm really just noodling how if that money came into government, can we put guardrails on it? Maybe not with full limiting dedications like the alcohol tax and the marijuana tax to, you know, so something to think about since I have lots of really good thinkers here. Also, if we were to dedicate a quarter of it, again, we'd be dealing with about a $15 million bucket over 7 years. The total need for us to replace our public safety and snow fleet is $77.5 million. That would leave $137 million that could be dedicated towards something like housing development. So I just want to put those pieces back out when we start to wrestle with the numbers. I can hear you and I can see possible pathways forward. So I want us to collectively think about it together. Thank you.
There was
They're
nodding.
thinking
Let
about it.
let the record reflect there was nodding. Okay. Yeah, if you want to, you can speak to it, or Miss Brawley, and then we'll pivot over. Okay, and Miss Brawley.
Thanks. Yeah, and I really appreciate the comments that you all have made. I mean, as I've said prior today, I think they're in line with some of my concerns. I guess the other thing I'm hearing as a theme in your comments is that there's a lot of interest in investing in Anchorage, right? I think that the question is really how do we do that, and what is the theory of change and the return on that? And I think the one that's been presented now is let's build essentially a lot of recreational facilities and provide property tax relief. That is the fundamental thing. Granted, there are other pieces of it, and so I guess I'm concerned. I'm interested in two things from you guys, and maybe this also gets to Lisa and Co. You would be able to respond to this as well. I think there's a real gap between the people who are not experiencing economic struggle and the people who are. And I think that is what's coloring a lot of the view of this tax, the viability of this tax, and really how we prioritize things. So I want to put that on the table. But I also would like to hear from you all, from your perspective. And I heard housing already. What do you think residents need? Not what residents want. What do you think this community needs? And I would be curious because, again, it gets to where we put the equivalent of a quarter of our operating budget every year that we would be pulling in with this tax or more. And so I think that the scale of this is huge. And so I want to step back, and I would love to hear from you all what you think we need.
Let me just start by saying, yes, to answer your question, there is definitely a gap. If you cannot relate, you can't see it. And so that's why I think it's so important that we make sure at the table we have people that are diverse. They come from different backgrounds, and then the product ends up being better. I'll stop there.
Hi, I'm Lisa Aquino from the Anchorage Neighborhood Health Center, and I'm actually this is not a part of my testimony with Foraker, who I'm actually here to present, but just to respond to you. Something I think housing people need, but I just want to also put out there something that I see a lot of people that need, and I've seen it in my job at Catholic Social Services and at Anchorage Neighborhood Health Center, and that I think the Muni has a strong role in is transportation. This city is impossible to get around. That makes it hard to work, and that makes it hard to live. So I'll just put that out there.
Interesting. That's the first time those words have come up in this conversation, I think, and it's not one that we don't talk about a lot. And so, okay, now we're going to pivot back. We have about 10 minutes. We have 3 members who haven't spoken, and then we want to conclude with the sponsors to have some kind of final notes.
Hi, we're going to take a little bit of different tact here from the 4-Acre Group. I'm Wendy Lindskog. I serve on the governance board of the 4-Acre Group. I'm here today with Lisa Aquino, who serves on the 4-Acres operations board, and also on the phone is Dr. Michael Walsh, 4-Acres Vice President of Public Policy, who is participating via teleconference. And I think we want to share just a little bit of a message of gratitude.
We've brought some concerns to the sponsors of the bill through, testimony, conversations, working with AEDC, and we feel very much that we have been listened to. The Foraker Group is not taking a position for or against the proposed sales tax at this time. We have been closely monitoring and engaging with the ordinance, however, and focusing on how nonprofits are treated, particularly with respect to the proposed exemptions, processes, definitions, and certification. And obviously, there are a lot of concerns and other issues, but with regard to some of the things that we raised, the substitute has integrated those changes. And so I'll keep my comments short, but just we do want to thank you for being receptive to those comments that we have made. And just for the record, for those of you not familiar with the Foraker Group, we provide capacity building services to nonprofits and tribes across the state. And we advocate for nonprofit public policy that impacts these organizations. So we have a large voice with those nonprofits, and here in Alaska, we represent 14% of the nonprofits, represent 14% of the municipality's workforce. So they do play a vital role in every community across the state. These organizations are essential to the safety net, the quality of life, and economic development in Anchorage and throughout Alaska. So again, I just want to thank you for listening to us and hearing us. And I want to just say we're here as a resource from the Foraker Group to really help bring our research and our expertise and our insight as we work with our nonprofit colleagues. So thank you for hearing us, and I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Wendy. And hi, I'm Lisa Aquino at the Anchorage Neighborhood Health Center, and here representing the Foraker Group Operations Board. And I just want to reiterate what Wendy said. We're very grateful that the substitute version seems to have addressed a lot of the current concerns that Foraker brought. But I wasn't at the previous session, so I'm sure some of this was already covered, but I would just like to have it on the record. So some of the issues we brought, just to understand the point of view of nonprofits. So some of our major concerns were that the exemption only applied to charitable 501(c) organizations, and we suggested the exemption apply to all nonprofits because of their role in our economy and their work to uphold this city. And then another one of our major concerns was that the exemption would only apply to nonprofits registered in Anchorage. And this would eliminate so many organizations people care about and that do business here and that are registered in another part of the state or nationally. And again, that has been addressed in the newer version. Another concern was that there was really no language on how nonprofit exemption would be implemented. And we're really deeply concerned about that. And that was addressed, and we just really appreciate that. And then finally, that in the original proposal, that there was this differentiating between nonprofit organization and mission when there's no difference. As a nonprofit, what we do is our mission. That's how we work. And so all of those have been addressed, and we just want to sincerely thank you for that. And I'll pass it back to Wendy.
Probably no need to pass it back to me, but thanks again for hearing us. And again, we're a resource for you as you go through this very difficult process and an important public policy decision. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'll go ahead and pivot to the sponsors.
Thank you.
Sorry. I think you were kind of with Kurt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, okay. Thanks, Mr. Rivera. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. As much outreach as we did, it's never enough, right? And we felt like we did a lot, but maybe not the right channels. This has been, and thank you, Member Volan, for your comments. I really appreciate that because the baby's a little beat up at the moment. Which we knew would happen. And it's about having a conversation. I think we all agree that Anchorage needs something, which we're calling revitalization. Again, it's a very long road. And through AEDC, we are trying to model other cities, Oklahoma City being one of them. Oklahoma City started this journey 30 years ago. They've passed this 4 times. What was passed last does not look like what was passed first. There's so many ideas that have come forward, like we need to rebuild all our schools and put money here, put money there. It's not feasible. We've got to start somewhere and start the ship rolling, start raising the tide that'll raise all the ships. And ideally, if it works, it gains voter trust. It limits regressivity, which we're desperately trying to do. And I appreciate most of all the solutions, because we've had solutions and it's just not feasible when you get the lawyers involved. But again, it's a long road. And I think what we want to show, we want to have the conversation. And as someone said the other night, if not this, then what? If not now, then when? And that's probably one of my fears. And it's not a sense of urgency. I know we have a deadline of an April ballot. We tried to start as early as we could. My fear is that we don't make the April ballot, and that's it. I don't remember when the first trip to Oklahoma City was, but it was probably 4 or 5 years ago, and nothing's happened. So hopefully this drives that conversation, whether it makes a ballot or not, whether it gets approved by voters or not, that someone will pick up the mantle and carry on the next best idea and reach higher and stand taller because they're standing on our shoulders or bones, as it may be. So, but again, thank you. And thank you, Foraker, because your message that we listen to you is what we're trying to show, is that we are listening and we are trying to modify as best we can. I guess last statement is it's all data driven for most part. And we don't want to get too far off, because if we get too far off, then we know it won't pass. And at the end of the day, that's zero. And we have to move the dial. And again, someone else can pick it up. Thank you.
Right, Kirk, I'll just say that I think we probably share an origin story. Are you going to go?
Yeah.
Go ahead. I didn't know.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've really appreciated both of the conversations that we've had today, the work session before and this one. I knew coming into this that this proposal wouldn't have an easy path forward. There are a lot of strong voices with strong interests in the future of the city. And we all love the city. We want to do the right thing for it. And we're not all going to agree on the path forward. That's why I really appreciate these opportunities. And honestly, I wish we had even more of them before we got here today, but here we are. So here's what I can tell you. We've all listened to you, not just the sponsors of the ordinance, but everyone here has listened to you. And here continues the political process to get to a product that achieves the goal and reduces harm as much as possible. I really actually love some of the ideas that we heard today, and I can commit for myself to looking into these for inclusion into the proposal. But from here, Member Soltz and I, as the original sponsors of the proposal and the coalition behind Project Anchorage, we're going to look at all of the ideas proposed and see what we can do to include them in an S version. So I think contrary to maybe what you heard at the last work session, we are going to look at all the different amendments and possibly include some amendments into an S version, and then leave perhaps some of the more controversial or difficult to achieve amendments to hash them out on the dais. So just wanted to let people know that we are going to be looking at making some changes based off what we heard. Thank you.
Thanks. Please don't change the S, because we can't get it. We don't have enough council capacity. So I'm actively working on amendments. And if you move the ball, then I have to go back and retool my amendments.
Yeah, I should clarify. So we will see, but our goal is to still get this onto the December 17th agenda.
I don't want to have to wait and work over my holiday to write. You have an S now.
Sure.
So, I'm hoping that this will just be the S submitted, because this is what the amendments are now being prepared off of.
Thanks for that feedback. I think there
I'll just
other
say,
members
hold
who
on,
have different opinions.
I'll just say any member can do anything, and there's just a level of respect that's been requested, and it's possible that council can somehow work with the amendment sponsors to ensure that if there's moving processes, they're aligned somehow, but to protect people's holidays, hopefully. And so any member can, but that's any member can, but should they, or how should they? I will just note, Kurt, I think our origin stories are fairly similar. I was a poor kid. My mom had to make hard decisions. There were 3 children and a single mom in an expensive place, and we had to choose what we were going to eat. We had to get free food, and it was a struggle. And I only had medical care because of the Medicaid program when I was a child, and I will always stand up for the people who are in the place where I came from, and I see that in you, and I appreciate it. So, any further comments? No. Okay, we'll be adjourned. Everybody have a great weekend, and lots of work to be done.